I wanted to do a little tutorial on how I make and design my signs. Um, Basically, this is working off of this guy Mark Gurry's tutorial. He only has 3 videos on his channel, but they're incredibly helpful. And I see a lot of people on Facebook, the Bamboo Lab Facebook page, making um, objects like this, doing science coasters, whatnot, building these images into um, their projects. And I really like his tutorial. It's really helpful. This one with the Starbucks coffee coaster, a little confusing for me, but I suppose if it makes sense to you, then that works. Um, but kind of working off of his idea, instead of having it 1 layer thick, like if you want to make a coaster with some thickness to it, or you want to make like a sign you can hang up on the wall that you want to be more than a millimeter or two thick. This is kind of how I do that. So building off of his um, tutorial, I start with an image, basically just Google whatever you want. In his video, he has some suggestions on how to get high quality graphics from different companies, Starbucks or whatever company if you want to do that. I just like making these fun signs. Um, this is one of them. And so Google it, download it, make sure it's a large file, high resolution. This one showed to be a large resolution, but if you zoom in, it kind of not really, but it'll work. Um, so you'll import that, open that in whatever photo editing, vector editing software you like. Rather, I use Illustrator. Import the file, and then you're going to want image trace, and basically wind up getting. This is kind of weird. You're going to wind up with something that looks like this at the end. You just want outlines basically. Once that's done, you'll export as an SVG, save it to your computer, wherever you save it, and then you're going to go to whatever 3D modeling software. I use Fusion. You can use whatever other software is out there. I've only ever used Fusion. Um, so you're going to open that in here. You're going to import SVG. Go to wherever you keep it. Oops. Import it onto whatever plane you want. Hit OK. Don't worry about the scale when you import. Um, Sometimes when you import SVGs into Fusion, the scale is kind of screwed up. We can fix that when we get into Bamboo Studio. So once you get into Fusion, import your image. You should have a 2D sketch. Everything should be filled in blue. That means your sketch is solid. Then you're going to start extruding colors. So you're going to do one color at a time. If it's 2, 3 colors, shouldn't take that long. Kind of tedious, but it works out in the end. And once you've done all of that, you'll get a product like this. And in my case, the background of the sign is orange, and some other stuff, the text is all black. If the back of your sign is going to be white, don't extrude the background of the sign. Just extrude the letters or whatever's colored. Anything white, just leave empty. And I'll explain that later. So for this sign, this is what you're going to get. And so what I do is when I extrude everything to at least something, at least a thickness, something a multiple of your layer height. So I do 0.2 millimeter layer height. So I extrude to 0.8 millimeters. I found that at least 3 to 4 times the thickness of your layer height is sufficient to keep your white background from bleeding through. But you can do whatever thickness you want. Mine, I just happen to do 0.8. It actually prints really quick. Well, once you get into Bamboo, I'll show you how quick this prints. And of course, you can make the backer as thick as you want. So this is going to be the colored portion. We're going to go into here. I'm going to close this out. And this is where you got to kind of decide how thick you want your signs, because you're going to create sort of the white base of your sign. And it's a really simple sketch, basically 2D rectangle, extrude to however thick you want this overall sign to be, and then you can either add or subtract your colored portion thickness. You know, I ended up with a 3 mil thick base, and then you add on 0.8 millimeters. Is really not that big a difference. Add whatever corner radius you want. When you're importing the design into Adobe, sometimes the border will have either squared off edges or rounded edges. I like to delete the outermost box and make my own with the same radius as my sign. So I do 3 millimeter corner radiuses. So this is going to be a 3 millimeter corner radius, and it'll match my base corner radius. Once that's done, you'll extrude that to whatever thickness you want. You're going to export this and your colored extrusion and colored portion as STLs. And once that's done, you're going to go to Bambu Studio. And this is the important part. So when you're importing the objects, the STLs, for my method to work, and maybe this is sort of a fault of Bambu, maybe once they figure out how to reorder, let you reorder objects, this will work. This will work better. But for the time being and the way I do it, you have to import the base first, because the way that Bambu Studio orders the objects is kind of weird. It's like whatever you put on the plate first goes at the top. So if you import the colored portion first, that's going to be at the top, and then your base will be at the bottom. When you center everything up, assemble it, it just doesn't come out right. But I found that if you import the base first, so that's at the top of the object list, and then the colored portion, that seems to work pretty well. So we're going to go to oh, I'm sorry. I said I did 3 mil corners. These are actually 1.5 mil corners. So you're going to import the base to your sign first. It's going to import as whatever your default color is. We'll change that to white. We'll move that up for the time being. And then we'll import our colored portion. And you notice these are two different sizes. So this is why I said when you import to Fusion, don't worry about the scaling of the size there, because we can always adjust it here. So first thing I'll do is make sure my see, this one actually happened to import right, because when you when you create something in Fusion and then export it, it seems to save the scale correctly, whereas when I imported the SVG from Illustrator to Fusion, it screwed the scale up, but that's not important. So you'll see that it screwed the scale up and it's too small, so we'll just make sure we unclick Uniform. I like to make 150 by 100 mil signs. It's a pretty decent size. You can make it as big or small as you want. Just be careful making them too small and having real small text or images. They might not come out so great. And you'll see that our thickness is 0.8 millimeters. You can change that from here. Like I said, in Fusion, I extruded it to 0.8, and it comes in as 0.8. Just make sure you uncheck uniform scale, then make it whatever size you want. So once this is in here, this is when you're going to want to color and flip and orient everything correctly. So the first thing I do is lay on the face so it flips the image properly. So that bad example, but there we go. So I flipped the image first, and then I separated into objects. And now you can see all the objects. I also like to rotate it. Oh, wrong way. Rotate it first. All right, rotate before you separate into objects. Rotate it, lay it on its face, so it's technically, when you're looking at it this way, it's mirrored. But I just like it facing right side up. Then you're going to separate into objects, and you'll see it looks mirrored because it's going to print upside down. But then if you look from the underside, it's right side up. So that's what you want. And then I print with a textured PI plate. It gives it a nice, not really rough texture, but it's not smooth. You don't really see layer lines. You don't see, um, everything's kind of blended real nice, and it gives a real nice look to your sign. Um, so once that's done, you're going to go in and you're going to color everything according to what you want. So, oops, that's not what I wanted. Try that again. Select the layer or the object, and then hit your number keys corresponding to whatever color you want. And then you can just hit the down arrow, and just go to town coloring all your objects. And then once you get to the other color, I'm going to do orange, so I'll start going to town. There we go. Coloring all that. So once that's done, you'll have your colored sign. Make sure everything's colored correctly the way you want it. And then you're going to select. This gets kind of tricky. Make sure that's out of the way. Oops. See, I screwed up there. So I moved that off the build plate, and that moved that to the bottom. So what we want to do is select, move your base off the bottom, move that off. Take your base, put that back on so it's at the top of your object list. Make sure you don't move that off. Select your colored objects. There you go. And make sure that's in the right order. You always want to make sure your base, or the backer, whatever you want to call it, is at the top of your list. So select all of these, center it, select your backer, center it, and you're going to select everything. And you're going to assemble. And that'll turn that into one solid object. So it's going to look kind of funky just because of the way that Bamboo renders these 3D objects. Go to Slice, and you should have this. Should have a nice, clean, colored sign. And if you notice that the colored layers are only 3 layers thick, or 4 layers in my case, and then you have the white backer. So if we scroll through the slices, you notice it prints the colored layers first, and then it just starts laying in the background. You can change up the infill and the wall loops, however many walls you want. You don't really need to go crazy. I typically just stick with 15% or less infill. I would avoid grid, as that pattern sort of runs over itself, and you might run into the problem of the printhead, the nozzle, kind of knocking this loose. I like rectilinear. You can do whatever you want. I mean, unless you don't do a top infill. I just realized I hit the mic there. Sorry. Um, unless you don't do a top surface. So if we do no top shells, go slice. You can put, whatever pattern, infill pattern you want, and that'll show up if if you want the back to have some sort of pattern. I just at least 2 shell layers, whatever the default is. Like I said, 15% or less. You don't need a ton unless you're planning on, beating this thing up, but you really don't. You really don't need high infill. And like I said, after you slice it and you look from the bottom, it should be nice and clean. Sometimes where is it? Oh yeah, under quality, wall generator. Sometimes, depending on the text or if there's images, sometimes the wall generator, the classic wall generator, you get kind of weird lines. Using Arachne sometimes fixes that, but also at other times, Arachne kind of hurts you. It leaves open gaps where there shouldn't be gaps, and sometimes you can see that in the final product. but I usually just stick with classic. And then I also stick with one outer, one inner wall. You can do one, doesn't really matter. Like I said, when the sign's printed, because it's printed on the base plate, all your basically this is basically your first layer. It's all blended together, nice and clean. You don't really see these layer lines at all, so don't worry about, if you zoom in, you see some open spots here. That's all going to go away and kind of be blended together uh, when the first layer prints. So yeah, technically first layer on these are pretty important. Um, Using glue, if you use a cool plate and you use glue, it's probably going to show up unless you use like a clear glue or something that doesn't leave stains. I just use a textured PI plate, so I don't use glue for that, and it leaves a nice textured finish. You don't see layer lines. Um, any kind of small details are kind of worked out, so it works out pretty well for me. Um, Yeah, and this actually print really quick. This one's an hour, 18 minutes, 6 filament changes, and that's even less if you do fewer layers. But like I said, usually at least 3 to 4 times your layer height and colored layer thickness is what you want to go for. You can go more or less. It really doesn't use a whole lot of filament. Total filament's under 50 grams, which is not a lot. Flushed is under a gram, and then the model itself is, the majority of it. But it really doesn't waste a whole lot. Takes pretty quick. It's pretty quick to print. Doesn't take a whole lot of time. And this is a pretty big sign. 150 by 100. Um, you can get a ton of these off in a day, or you can actually print 2 of these on one build surface. So once we've done everything, you can just clone it. And set that there. You have to rearrange so it doesn't hit these calibration lines, because that will show in your print. So make sure you rearrange or don't do the flow cal. Um, but it's basically an extra hour, same amount of filament changes. Um, Obviously double the filament. Um, but yeah, I mean those are 2 pretty big signs. I'll open up something else I did here. I'm not going to save that. I'll open up another file, another thing I did for a friend. Where is it? Oh, there we go. I got a friend who's a real big Bills fan, and I made him some Bills coasters. These came out really nice. The blue I have isn't as dark as sort of the Bills blue, and the red isn't as dark as the Bills red, but they still came out really nice. And this actually, I could probably have gotten away with making these a bit thicker, so because I think the white kind of showed through. But if we slice these, this is one of these images where you don't want to um, extrude the background. And actually, this didn't even have a background. This is just the Bills logo and the Bills text. Um, and actually, this one here, if you notice, there is some gaps that didn't fill in. So this may have actually benefited from. See, I did Arachne. If you do classic, yeah, still kind of left some open gaps. You'll have to kind of play around and see what works. But these actually came out really nice. I printed these kind of quick, so I didn't really have time to screw around with settings. These 4, they were 3 by 3, I want to say. I forget how big they were. But they filled up majority of the build plate, and they only printed. It only took 2.5 hours to print. 3 color changes, under 100 grams of filament. And the infill, I believe, was like 20%. Yeah, 20%. Probably didn't need to be that much, but yeah, didn't take long at all to set up and print out, and the product turned out really well. But yeah, that's basically it. Like I said, kind of working off of that Mark Curry guy's YouTube video on how he does his single layer thick prints. And this is kind of how I do mine. So you can do the reverse where you have the image printed on top, but you do risk having those layer lines show where printing upside down, printing on the build plate, if you have a nice clean build plate and you don't use like a cool plate with glue, you get a nice clean crisp image. I mean, if you're not really into that textured look, which, honestly, if you've printed stuff with it, you kind of know what it looks like, but it's really not that bad. I think they come out nice. Um, I think they look a lot better than, printed right side up with the top surface layers showing. I mean, if you're into that, to each their own. But yeah, that's basically it. That's kind of how I make my signs and coasters and whatnot. Feel free to mess around, have fun. Uh, change it up if you have some suggestions or ways to speed up the workflow. All for it. So thanks for listening. I know this was a bit long-winded, but hope you learned something new and have a good rest of your day.